My name is Andy Pattee. I'm the superintendent of the Cedar Falls Community School District. We are very excited to bring to you this episode of Parent University. Parent University is a program that is intended to provide insights, knowledge, and information to our constituents, especially our parents, about the school district and what is happening within the school district and throughout the school district. We hope this is informative, and we hope that this helps guide people to be able to be knowledgeable and be involved with the processes and our school district in the Cedar Falls community. Today, we are very excited to start talking about the new high school and some of the processes that have been occurring over the last several months since the referendum that took place in June. The caveat, we want to thank all of our community for their support and for approving that high school. We know it's going to be a great enhancement for not only our school district, but our community and the region. So today, we are very excited to be joined by Brian Sanderman and Brad Leeper from Envision Architecture. Thank you for being here and speaking about this process. We do know it's been several months since the bond referendum. There's a lot been going on. School has started. Winter is starting to approach. Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done over the course of the last 4 to 5 months?
Sure. Well, we're getting started having some conversations. You know, as we as architects like to draw, and trying to keep our pencils down is really important so that we're drawing the right things when we get to that point. So we've started with the community conversation. And that begins with a very broad conversation with the community. And over the last 10 plus weeks, we've really met with over 1,000 people in 100 different meetings and talking about things like cost and needs and sustainability, acoustics, all of these kinds of things, the site. And we call this our chaos slide. And we have a lot of these needs, and we're trying to make sense of them all before we start drawing, basically. So this is the first step in our process of discovery, which is the listening phase. And then we'll move on to strategy, which is, you know, what are the strategies to implement those ideas that we heard from the community? And then finally implementation in actually making the project happen.
And what I've been so amazed about is, as you talked about, the number of people involved, the number of meetings, the depth of conversations to really focus on education, curriculum, what this means for learning as we look at design development with all those residual bubbles, what it means for our community as a larger group on how to utilize the space efficiently and effectively. I think one of the exciting points of this too, we had an Insight Week 1.0 now roughly almost 2 years ago, with a lot of community conversations about envisioning what education could look like with a new building. Could you talk a little bit about the Insight Week 2.0 that we've held?
Yeah, so we kicked off Insight Week 2.0 this year, as you're talking about, Andy, as the bond passed, and really did that again with this series of meetings and thinking about education and that process and what that means really more specifically to the new high school project as it's being developed. So again, a series of meetings. We kicked it off with an all-staff meeting, had the whole teacher group there, give them initial update of what this process is going to look like and what that's going to be about, and give them a sense of where we're going with the planning of the project. So we met with then individual departments throughout the school. That's teachers, as well as we've met with the food service groups. We've talked with custodial, several groups across the school to get an understanding of what the new high school means. And again, started a lot of our initial meetings with them, again, listening. But as you can see from some of the images here, we did start drawing a little bit about what those things start to mean in terms of the types of spaces they're getting into. We also met with student groups. Had a great student conversation, again, about what this new high school and what their viewpoint is on learning, and try to get an understanding from that perspective as well, which is really helpful as we look forward to the new school and what it becomes.
I think one of the most exciting aspects when you receive input from students, they typically have been involved in seeing other buildings across the state, sometimes across the nation with their activities. So I'm sure their insight was extremely valuable and certainly informative to help guide this process too.
We always get the best feedback from the students. They see what their peers have, and they just think about education in a different way, which is really exciting.
That's really neat. I know we worked hard for community engagement, and you spent a great deal of time going out into the community, asking different groups to give input, but also had multiple groups come into meetings to be able to provide deeper level input as well.
Yeah, so we started with some community discussions, and we have some interactive exercises that we went through with the community where we went out to meet the community where they were, and some of that was about, we went to the farmer's market one weekend and spent a morning there where we had some interactive discussions with people. And what we found broadly with the community discussions were really, people's perception of the school and success is really linked to ACT scores. So we asked people what success meant to them for the community. And really, ACT testing was kind of at the bottom of the list. And what we heard more was about engaged citizenship, really career readiness in a very broad way, and some college credit. Everyone's excited about their kids saving some money and getting some college credit while they're in high school. We also met with staff in a similar fashion, and staff had a very broad view kind of where we want to be and where we're going, and they really want to rethink some of the components of Power Hour and how we engage students in a broad way. They really want to be bold in a significant way for the school, and really talked about being a national leader in education. And really talked a lot about kind of flexible learning environments and how that impacts students in a broad way. And lastly, we met with students again, and the students really talked a lot about, as I mentioned earlier, that they think about education in a different way. They see spaces like a library feeling more like a cafe, and really looking at education in a very broad kind of way. They like college and career prep. They want to be very bold. They want to be even bolder than the teachers are in terms of how we think about this design. So that was something we heard, and you can see some of the exercises we went through with some voting exercises with people.
I think it's really exciting as you go through and talk not only about the diversity of thinking amongst all the groups, but some of the similarities in thinking with the dots and the matrix, not only from our community groups through the farmer market, through the football game that you attended to get input, but also from our students and staff, because some of those phrases were similar, and to see how that kind of was either cross groups, cross generations, cross our community. There were a lot of thoughts about making sure that we are focused on excellence, that we're focused on being bold, that we're focused on making sure that we are looking at students' college and career readiness, helping them be better citizens, making sure that we are always mindful of helping students be college and career ready to go out into the real world. And I think that was exciting to see. Certainly something that we want to continue to focus on and continue to make sure we do excellent work around.
Absolutely.
I think one of the other aspects and next slides that we lead into here is some of the process of the discovery meetings and what this led into next based on the work that was done. And I know early on we had some design drivers that were created out of the 1.0 Insight Week. Can you talk a little bit about what the process has led us into based upon that?
Yeah, so we saw very similar kind of responses in a deeper way, I think, as we went through and had more significant conversations with the group. But our original drivers of connectedness, community, and co-location and diversity were all still very relevant as we went through those, but we wanted to dive in a little bit deeper. And so the next slide is really going into that connectedness piece of it, And really what that means is that we have more visually open space. The existing high school is very siloed in terms of where groups are in the building, and there's not a lot of connectivity between students and particularly staff and connections to what's going on in the building. So we want to break down those silos and also think about education in a little bit more connected fashion in terms of theory, which we might get in a normal classroom, versus ideation, kind of design and making, and really getting a broader spectrum of learning.
I'm really excited too. As we walk through this process, we talked about some of our community conversations. We brought in, as that prior slide showed, UNI and representatives from UNI, representatives from Hawkeye Community College, representatives from multiple business and industries. And I really love the fact, and I think it's so important when we talk connectedness, it's not connectedness internally about some of the connections we know we need to have educationally, but connectedness out with our community, with our region, with our parents, with our universities, which is so important in this day and age.
Yeah, and that's the second piece of that is the community co-location is the next slide. And that's really about that, right? How do we connect with all of these? We have some great resources in the Cedar Valley. How do we take advantage of them? How do we bring them into the building? And the community really saw this building as an asset, right? That we asked the question of, is this a school that the community uses, or is it a community space that the school happens to use? And I think people feel broadly this is a community asset. We want to use it as broadly as we can. And then the final one is really about this diversity of spaces, and that's about providing a variety of spaces. There are a lot of classrooms in the existing building. You know, it's a lot of classrooms and corridors, and we want to provide some different levels of spaces. Excuse me, from both private to public, and then bring some of those kind of maker spaces out of the dungeon. Those are spaces that are typically kind of in the back of the building, the wood shop and the metals and the maker spaces and labs, and bring those out in front of people so we can see things going on. And it's part of that component of kind of theory to making and pushing that, all tying back to that career readiness that we talked about earlier.
I want to take a step back a couple slides. We glossed over something real quick. Throughout the discovery process, I know this is a large building. This is a large project as we look at it as scope. One of the things that I know you have done as a design group, built a team, and part of that team is consultants that have been involved with this work. Can you talk about some of the consultants, especially as you know some of these design drivers, and how those fit back into some of these consulting groups that are part of your team?
Yeah, so like you said, it's a complex building. It's a large building. We're not just doing a piece of a high school, we're doing a whole new high school. So really some large, more specific components are things like the theater, the auditorium piece. So we'll have a consultant that will be alongside us as we design and think about that. We'll also have a food service component here. We'll be integral to this building, working with a consultant there, Rippey & Associates. The Sextant Group will help us with AV and technology. That, as we all know, is something that is huge in 21st century learning, and how the students are interacting with technology, what that means to the teachers, and how they want to teach. So we've been bringing these consultants into meetings as well, and engaging with the teachers with these consultant groups, and getting that input across the building. Different spaces that are also needing to be thought about are the acoustics in them, not just in the theater, as we may think, but there's lots of kids throughout this building, so we really want to take careful consideration into the acoustics of each space throughout the building as we design it.
And I think it's also exciting to know that we are looking environmentally at this building to make sure that we are not only trying to become zero kind of carbon footprint and net zero as a building, or at least net zero ready as a building.
Sure.
And I know there's some consultants involved with that as well, which is exciting as we look at being mindful of our environmental impact, not only with this, but into the future.
Yeah, I think some of those things are nice to see, but we know that those things impact education and learning in very broad ways in terms of views out to the exterior, in terms of natural lighting, acoustics, and just the environment. Those are all very important things that impact learning, and we're really looking at those in very specific ways as we go through the process.
And it's just so important for our community, our parents, to understand that we are taking a very holistic approach to this with a lot of input and being very mindful through those steps.
Yeah, that sustainability piece is not just, we traditionally think about energy, which is great, but it goes into all those things Brad was mentioning. It's that the whole environment that the students will be in and that the teachers will be in working every day.
Internally and externally,
Yeah.
which is very exciting.
Ultimately, this comes down to this building's going to last the community a long time. We want to make sure we get it right.
Exactly. I think one of the neat aspects that we've undertaken over the course of the last now multiple months, one trip was down south, and that took place down to the Kansas City area, as well as some of the Des Moines Metro new buildings that were built recently up to the Minneapolis area to look at new buildings up there. We took staff members, we had some community members that went, we had board members that went, and I think that was really eye-opening for a lot of people to be able to see what is out there with new buildings, what can change within educational spaces. We have, again, we say this quite frequently, the best staff in the world. And to be able to have spaces that help them maximize their talents, they were able to see some of those spaces in other places and what that could mean for student learning. Could you talk a little bit about some of those visits and processes?
Yeah, it was really great to engage that whole group and going to these tours in these different locations and really let them see something that's outside of their normal world. Some of the teachers get out there and have been able to see different buildings across the state or wherever they may travel, but some of them do not. So it's really good for them to get out. And then also these tours are great because the staff that's there especially is able to engage and talk with their peers and see if they have done something a little different in this school, how that applies and how it's really working. So we saw a lot of great things in different spaces that really connected back to the drivers and what we heard the staff is excited about. We saw spaces in specific small learning communities that are different than the current high school today. It's not just a row of classrooms with the hallway, really some breakout spaces to allow staff to explore how they're going to be teaching the students differently. So saw great examples of that in several different schools throughout our tours.
I think some of those tours are, some of it's to see good things, but it's also see some things that people do that didn't work. And I think we got that. And I think the other power of it is just the feel of a space and getting a sense of it. Because you can look at drawings all you want, and those are hard for people to understand sometimes. That's our business, but actually walking people through spaces, we get a sense of, I like that, oh, I don't like the way they did this. And it allows us to learn from someone else's mistakes, which is always better.
That is always better, exactly. And I think that was such a positive influencer in some of the early design work that you had, or at least the kind of the Insight 2.0 work with some of our staff members too, so they could say, remember, we saw this in this building. What would that look like potentially within our structure to enhance educational opportunities for students? And that was so worthwhile, taking those trips and looking at those buildings, and we appreciate your leadership and guidance on those. So very, very exciting. I think we do have a slide in here that talks about some of the different components from the tours, and there has been just an extensive list of notes, and this is just one slide of multiple, just to give kind of context for parents and community members. Certainly this doesn't include 1 through 25, nor does it include 32 through I think 46 that we have, and everything was kind of broken down into some detail areas, some likes, dislikes, some things that were maybe unique or unusual for us to consider or continue to ponder and dialogue and discuss. And I know this took a great deal of work based upon all the tours, but again, it was just a great insight that helped guide us through a lot of the early processes to get to the point where we're at.
Yeah, these will be guiding points for us as we really take, as Brad sort of started this discussion, this discovery phase is really about listening. And we're trying to keep our pencils down a little bit, but as we hear all these things, everyone starts to envision what the new Cedar Falls High School can be. So that's what's really exciting. The staff, the board members start to see in the buildings that they toured really what the high school can be. And then we as the design team start to see those things as well. What we saw the group get excited about, that gets us excited about how we can then weave that into what this design becomes.
So that leads us into next steps moving forward. We know that the fruition and the end goal is to have a building where students move into. Can we talk about the initial next steps?
Yeah, essentially our where we're at now in this process, like we said, we've been working several months and in design and the listening part. We'll spend the next several months here continuing the development of that design. And really, you haven't seen a lot of floor plans here today. That's really our next step in what we've already started working on a little bit. And that process will go for the next few months, and then we'll get into actually creating documents for the contractors to bid as well. Through probably about November, this time-ish next year. And we'll send documents out to bid and get that pricing about this time next year, hopefully. And then we'll move into construction starting in 2021. And then we're still looking at when the finish date of construction would be, but we're shooting for the August of 2024. And potentially, if depending on how schedule works, it could be an earlier start date than that.
It's a large process, large project, and certainly we know the importance of doing it well by taking our time, getting the insight early on to make sure that when we move into that building, everybody has that sense of pride and that sense of this was done right, and that's so important. At this time, I'm not sure there's other things that we were going to focus on or address. We appreciate all of our community, all of our parents, all of our students, all of our staff for the input they provided, for the input that they will continue to provide as we go through this process. We do know this has been really, really, I think, insightful as we've uncovered different hopes, wants, and wishes for this building. But we also know that the next steps as we start developing some of the plans and concrete examples of what these spaces will look like, that'll be another exciting point in this process. We want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching this episode of Parent University. Thank you for Envision, Brad and Brian, for being here and helping to guide us through this process. We look forward to the day when we come back to share some plans with everybody. And please reach out if you have any questions, have any thoughts or insight as we continue down this process, very important process of a new high school in Cedar Falls. Thank you.